Hi, welcome to ASEAN Kita with me, Farhad Hakimi, and today we will discuss and dive into the very foundation of ASEAN, the three pillars that uphold its vision and drive its progress. Well, the political, security, economic and socio-cultural pillars, which are more than just frameworks. They shape the way we navigate challenges and also foster cooperation and build a future that is both resilient and inclusive. But how do these pillars function in practice, and what role do they play in charting ASEAN's next course? Well, let's unravel their significance and decode their impact right here on ASEAN Kita with our guest, Dr. Noor Nirwandy Mat Noordin, Security and Political Analyst at the University Technology Mara UiTM Centre for Media and Information Warfare Studies. Good morning. Thank you for joining, Doctor.
Morning.
Well, let's try to give a clear comprehension on these pillars. Why are these three pillars essential to ASEAN's framework, and how do regional leaders actively leverage them in shaping policies and cooperation across member states?
ASEAN is a very unique establishment. The foundation of ASEAN lies into lots of factors. Among the factors are the elements that constitute what ASEAN are made of. And of course, this pillar inclusive of ASEAN political security community, ASEAN economic security, and ASEAN socio-cultural community. It's important to drive ASEAN into a certain value into the regional stability, diplomacy elements, economic security, the non-interventions policy, because this is the foundation. So it becomes a fundamental element for the ASEAN to move forward and how to look into the ASEAN establishment. And in regard of this context, with the global disparity of the economics, with the element that we have in digital divide, the cybersecurity issues and all the elements, there are also some elements that can be included as ASEAN positive element. And of course, ASEAN's party countries like Malaysia, Singapore, Thailand are the middle power of the global player. So these also bring a new valuations of ASEAN. But in order to look into that, moving forward into the ASEAN establishment, into ASEAN foundations, what can ASEAN do in the current situations, in the global perspective, the regional perspective, it's important for ASEAN to be driven by these strategic pillars. And all these pillars have all their fundamentals element in it. For example, if we look into ASEAN political security community, to look into the stability of ASEAN, to make sure that ASEAN's diplomatic non-intervention element, the ASEAN mechanisms in putting up peace, democratic society, the element of human security being valued in ASEAN community is something that look into a very transactional process for us. So this bring into a new valuation of ASEAN. Important for us also to understand in the context of this diplomatic element, the unilateral, bilateral and multilateral ASEAN element. ASEAN basically is much more towards the unilateral, not more like unilateral as more the superpower, but much more towards the bilateral and multilateral assistance cooperation between the ASEAN countries. So this level up ASEAN into important regional global players, and of course the middle powers in ASEAN countries, they are pushing forward the economic and stability of ASEAN. But however, there are some challenges that we might facing ahead. But it is important to drive ASEAN to these three basic pillars of ASEAN political security community, ASEAN economic community, and of course ASEAN social cultural community, because this will drive ASEAN into what are to maneuver ASEAN in regards what are the circumstances, the global politics, the regional value. However, ASEAN need to be united, and this is important. What ASEAN have all the elements of chairmanships annually to make sure that ASEAN focus, ASEAN preserves, ASEAN identity is maintained regardless what are the current global situations that we have today.
Well, let's unravel one of the three pillars that we have, ASEAN Political Security Community, or APSC. If you look at it, ASEAN follows the principle of non-interference, which means countries don't interfere in each other's internal affairs. But modern threats like cybercrime, terrorism and border disputes affect multiple countries at once. So given this, how does the APSC reconcile sovereignty with the need for collective security, especially in transnational crises such as cyber threats and terrorism?
It is an interesting discussion, because when we talk about this non-intervention policy of the ASEAN, of course, it talks about the elements of conflicts, because this non-intervention policy have bring ASEAN to move forwards in looking into the element that first, of course, status in the Article 2 of United Nations, the element of sovereignty by a state nation that must not be intervened, must preserve or must held a form of sovereignty over all the issues, element of threats and any coercive decisions or process by other countries in the world. But however, these elements of non-intervention have its advantages and disadvantages. The advantages, of course, it brings the stability, the democratic peace element, it brings the regional stability in the nations, it brings into the values of ASEAN sovereignty, that all the members of ASEAN respected decisions of ASEAN members. But in regard of some certain situations, before we move into the much broader accounts, such as digital divide, the cyber crimes, and the transnational issue, we are talking about the issue, for example, in issues of Myanmar and Rohingya and the junta systems of administrative military system that we have in Myanmar currently. So this is something that has become, not to say it's a burden to ASEAN, but because of these non-intervention policies, ASEAN always resorted to this diplomatic mechanism, and public diplomacy is seen as the best elements to restore and to resolve any form of conflict in ASEAN. But giving into this particular process, so it also become derailed in some situations, and of course, it some extended the process of the conflict because of this ASEAN non-intervention policy. However, in some contexts of cybersecurity mechanisms, in the foundations of all the transnational crimes, I think the ASEAN has moved forward. ASEAN is basically collaborative, all the elements of interregional peace security. In fact, ASEAN come out into a certain, it's still in the context of not what we call being directors or be associated with some certain act of law, as what we have in the EU, Artificial Intelligence Acts and so on. But now ASEAN is also looking into its own form of artificial intelligence threats, cyber community, cyber crimes, community threats, and all the cybersecurity foundation, but it still fall into that non-intervention policy. But in terms of cooperation, I think ASEAN's are doing very well, and ASEAN to emulate some much more forward advanced country. For example, like our country like Malaysia, we have to look into, for example, for Thailand, they have their own artificial intelligence cybersecurity crime unit to into all the exercise, all the complaints, all the security probability risks that might be happen due to the cybersecurity and artificial intelligence process in the current and the future. So this is something that ASEAN have to emulate and have sent to brought back into some certain discussion to make it much more regionalized and to make it much more be shared of this common value, particularly looking into all the transnational crime. But again, the non-intervention policy is something unique on the ASEAN mechanisms of looking into the sovereignty of the state. But somehow or other, it also bring into some setback and disadvantages to restore some importance and to push into some important decision, particularly involving the physical conflicts, democratic conflicts, such as what happens and what we have now in the Myanmar, the Rohingya issue, the junta elements in Myanmar. And this is something that worry ASEAN, but this ASEAN again have to focus and to look forward on how to make sure that this non-intervention policy somehow already also brings some significant value in other form of cooperation, such as cybersecurity, artificial intelligence threat, and of course, the incoming transnational values. And this also look into the ASEAN particular process on how to deal with the China elements of South China Sea. And this is again bringing to some interruptions in the ASEAN, looking into on how ASEAN collaboratively can restore the sovereignty in the units of ASEAN, rather than looking to by these individualizations of the state, looking to unilateral interests of the state, but have to be in terms of multilateral sovereignty, unity of ASEAN, to forego the element of non-intervention at some point to look into much broader focus, particularly involving the image, identity ASEAN, and of course the stability of ASEAN, such as the South China Sea disputes by China, who have claims that is basically does not relevant or irrelevant against the UNCLOS Foundation. But again, this is something that ASEAN have to look to move forward, particularly in the ASEAN 2025 chairmanship by Malaysia, which include inclusivity and sustainability.
And of course, Dr. ASEAN makes decisions based on consensus, meaning all 10 member states must agree before taking actions. But some might argue, while this helps maintain unity, it can also slow down responses to urgent issues like the Myanmar crisis. So to what extent has ASEAN's consensus-based decision-making hindered or facilitated timely responses to geopolitical tensions in the region?
Whatever it takes for ASEAN to move forward, it have to become in a form of a bloc. So this is where when we have ASEAN chairmanship by annual basis, and it's supposed to be Myanmar by 2026, but of course I think the consideration have to be looked. In fact, much of the ASEAN countries are reconsidering whether ASEAN Myanmar will be the next ASEAN chairmanship due to the political crisis that we have in Myanmar currently. But again, in the form of decision making, in the form of getting consensus, this is what we call the beautiful part of the ASEAN inclusivity and sustainability, as what we call the theme of ASEAN Chairmanship 2025 by Malaysia this year. And looking into this consideration, wherever the form of discourse of actions, ASEAN summit that we have in Indonesia 2023, we have in Brunei in 2024, of course we have Malaysia in 2025. ASEAN really are looking forward into building up the foundations of bloc, looking into part that. And of course, COVID-19 also give us a good lessons on how ASEAN also need to have their own CDC, contact disease center, the vaccines implementations, vaccine mechanism, laboratory to come up with their form of vaccination, rather than the form of ASEAN dependent to all the superpowers, to European powers of bloc. We need that corrosion, of course, for sure. ASEAN need a form of concession, but moving forward, ASEAN need to have a form of subsidy. Therefore, there must be a form of leadership ASEAN, and all the middle powers in the ASEAN countries such as Indonesia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Singapore have to collaboratively bring ASEAN forward, because we have some little bit of elements. The consensus is quite sharp, it's quite okay. But in the context of some other countries that have lagged behind, for example, digital device, cybersecurity element for countries like Laos, Myanmar, Cambodia, which is something that picking up in the context of technological elements, putting up in form of technology, and of course economics apparatus in the countries of the ASEAN multilateral cooperation. But this also needs some form of consensus. Therefore, ASEAN need to bring forward a common value of economics, ASEAN Economics Community, ASEAN Political Security Community, and ASEAN Social Cultural Community on how to build up another form of consensus, maintaining the sovereignty, maintaining the unity, maintaining the ASEAN team inclusivity and sustainability. However, it also started to push what ASEAN into a new block of superpower regarding the middle power representation, to move ASEAN into higher level of global player, looking into all the regional peace and the global representative of ASEAN. And of course, strong ASEAN country. It was predicted, Farhan, that Indonesia and some other ASEAN country will be the next important economic player in the regions, in the global. And of course, this motivate ASEAN to work as a unity blocks, as a very united bloc in context of what we have the element today. And of course, it balances up the equilibrium between the superpower, the tensions of the war of tariff between the US and China, and of course, it will affect ASEAN in the long-term foundations. And as some of ASEAN countries also started to be in the BRICS, and of course, the recent integrations of Trump as president of US. Also, we look into on how ASEAN have to be more strong and more fundamental in getting some similar strategic, economics, political, security consensus to make sure that ASEAN valuations, ASEAN independence, and not much dependence into the other elements of superpower in some certain context, economics, security, and maintaining their own blocks of security economic foundation based on this diplomatic capability, remaining the elements of the security, but moving forward into what's next the ASEAN can bring into a regional stability and become the main dominant player in this region.
Right, Doctor. I think there's more to unravel, but we will take a short break, but stay with us as we will dive deeper into the topic, and stay with us right after this. Hi, welcome back to ASEAN Kita with me, Farhan Hakimi, and we were discussing about decoding the pillars of ASEAN with our guest, Dr. Noor Nirwandy Mat Noordin, Security and Political Analyst at University Technology Mara UiTM Center for Media and Information Warfare Studies. Well, Doctor, let's take the European Union, EU, for instance. They have a common security policy that allows its members to take collective action. ASEAN, on the other hand, relies more on informal diplomacy and voluntary cooperation. So how does ASEAN's political security framework compare to the European Union's common foreign and security policy in terms of effectiveness and autonomy?
What is deemed as ASEAN's strength somehow can give a little bit of setbacks into ASEAN capability. We look into some interesting global elements of organizations such as EU. They are most likely, or most of their binding elements, the elements of strategics, blueprint are basically binding with some certain acts. So this certain act can bring much forward into putting up responsibility. It has a legality elements, it carries a legal elements, the legal implications of what we call implications of what happens if some country breaches the elements of have been stated in the blueprint. For example, we look into the EU Artificial Intelligence Acts, EU Artificial Intelligence Blueprints, looking into EU Human Security Foundations elements. So this is something that binding the EU countries truly be serious in looking into these foundations when they are basically moving up into put up a strategic element. And EU always becoming a little bit of dominance comparing to the ASEAN in moving forward, because they need to maintain that disparity of the North-South element that have been looking into all the elementary of the diplomatic foreign policies and foreign affairs for the past decades in the world. So this is where ASEAN need to step forwards by reconsidering whether some certain elements of this interventions policy, some diplomatic, which is relevantly very good and have been proven and working so well till today, but where do ASEAN need to go next? Whether ASEAN need to deliberately looking into their legality element, implications of legal that brings some certain what we call much more harsh and the hard and sticks element rather than looking the carrot hard and stick soft hard power rather than looking to the soft power mechanism that being happening in the ASEAN today. Again, it needs some form of consensus. We need to look at the ASEAN are ready to move into these new implications of putting up some legal quandary, legal representations, legal implication about some certain thing breaches by some ASEAN representative, ASEAN organization, much of citizens of ASEAN, to really to bring ASEAN into another level. And of course, this is a big decision, Farhan. We have to be a bit much more of ASEAN consensus. Basically, I do agree into some certain element that ASEAN need to be in terms of putting some hard power. In fact, ASEAN might try to emulate what we have under foundations of EU, United Nations, or rather the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. They have their own, not to say Security Councils at the United Nations, but they have a very structured representation to look into all the mechanisms. So this is basically a leader ASEAN, starting with the Malaysia by 2025, our inclusivity and accessibility of Madani pillars being putting up in celebrations of ASEAN's motivation for the future and coming ASEAN next generations of leadership. So it is a consideration for me to put in that we have this beautiful element of human security, that making sure that all the elements of security in the context of ASEAN political security community to focus much more on the individual centric rather than state security. So the human security foundations we relied under the official coordination of internal affairs under the United Nations and under the resolution 66290, if I'm not mistaken, it's been gazetted in 2012 to look into the representations of this human security rather than look into the safety. So what are the list of the human security? Talk about food security, talk health security, environmental security, community security, individual security, and all the relevant security of individual centric, particularly on the cyber security. So this is what makes the strong value of human security foundation applied by United Nations to all the countries around the world. But ASEAN need to come up with their own form of terminology, their own definitions. What are the broader specific concepts of political community security? What are the elements of social cultural community, ASEAN economic community security? So the terminology, the theme of security have to be the new foundation of ASEAN, and it have to make sure that it carries some rather little bits of legal implication, some hard carrot and stick approach, rather than looking into totally soft power approach that motivate ASEAN's establishment until today, Farhan.
And Doctor, if you look at it, ASEAN focuses on diplomacy and dialogue. But in cases like the South China Sea, some might argue that a stronger approach is needed to resolve conflicts in light of recent regional disputes. Should ASEAN evolve, beyond soft diplomacy and adopt a more robust dispute resolution mechanism? How can this be done?
I do like the question, Farhan, because as a political and security analyst looking into the regional and global conflict, of course, the Trump presidential will bring huge impact to the global perspective of governance. And he has redefined what security is all about, looking to the unitarian interests of the United States of America as the American president. However, looking into these considerations, the superpower elements that we have between US and China, of course, China dispute, which is gained UNCLOS, which is supposed to be around 200, but nautical mile is supposed to be the regions or the things that permitted under the UNCLOS for us to look into, but China have claimed beyond of that, just because there's no certain form of specific boundaries, specific hazards, and specific particular elements that blocks between their form of claim. So this is very wrong. However, when ASEAN talk about its form of military security, ASEAN form of disparity of technology, ASEAN form of disparity of countering the elements using much more robust military, it is a big step in ASEAN to look into the industrial military and the concept of North and South the military industrial complex have been surrounding ASEAN for quite some time. In fact, they are global power. If you look into the NATO establishment by itself, you could see that there are some guaranteed element that EU countries in the EU state must have diverged or what much we call the much more advanced technological in terms of military weapons and other devices more than the other country around the world. In fact, if we look into the establishment funded by X that called the QME, which is written as qualitative military aid, giving a significant boost by the US towards Israel to make sure that Israel have advantages over any form of defense security measurements in terms of technology, military advancement of weapon against all the Middle East country. So this is what ASEAN need to think future ahead to look into that, not looking that we are provoking into a form of harsh action, much work towards hard power, but the concepts of deterrence is important in ASEAN security. So ASEAN need to develop this deterrence for its military power, for its cooperation between the countries, not to form out what we call a military race among the ASEAN countries, but much more towards the collaborative effort. Looking into what the NATO have, looking into the EU regulation that we have, looking into the economic elements, much more the bigger blocks of context of ASEAN. So this is where ASEAN need to put its foot on to make sure that they have their own economic deterrence, they have their own form of military deterrence, security deterrence, to make ASEAN as also one of the regional players, one of the sustainably block of defense that can be sustained or can defend itself by its own form of military achievements, military capability, and cooperation between the ASEAN countries. So this will become an adding value towards ASEAN. Again, this is a big decision. This is something will not be liked by some form of superpower blocks, some of other blocks of countries, and it will motivate ASEAN to change its human security concept back toward the state security. So this hybrid concept of human security and security have to be looked into much more deeper comprehension perhaps in order ASEAN to move forward. And might be this ASEAN 2025, although this is quite very sensitive, provocative discussions that might become one of the global headline, but again, ASEAN have to make a decision. ASEAN have to have the equilibrium between the hard and soft power, looking back into its non-intervention policy, and strongly consider of putting up its own deterrence by increasing its capability to defend itself in form of dispute or conflict, particularly the South China Sea conflict that we have today.
Yeah, very intriguing. Well, if you look at many statements by the leaders in the region, ASEAN aims to create a single market where goods, services and investments flow freely, but economic gaps between countries like Singapore and Myanmar remain a major challenge. So, well, if you look at ASEAN Economic Community, AEC, envisions ASEAN as a single market, yet economic disparities persist among member states. So how does ASEAN ensure equitable development while maintaining market competitiveness?
Country like China, country like US, and most of European countries, they have the edge over this because they basically can become a little bit of independence and using the unilateral approach in promoting and expanding and of course increasing the valuations in GDP in the countries by looking into its self-sustainable economic values, and of course this can evolve in lots of tariff war between terms and the current tariff war between European countries, between US, Canada and China, proven that this thing can be a form of capability by all these regional power, superpower. They have the capability of the economic powerhouse. ASEAN do not have this. ASEAN still need to have the cooperations among the countries. ASEAN are basically dependent towards the FDI in form of countries. In fact, our countries and some of the countries really depending on the FDI to move forward to increase that form of economic growth in our country and to perform a good high form of economic growth and to reduce the inflation rates in the country. And this sustainability of ASEAN is a major thing that have to be looked into the ASEAN. It requires a new economic blueprint. ASEAN have it all, the single market, to promote ASEAN stability, but ASEAN need to move forward. For example, looking into the health security blocks by itself, because this health security is a very huge industry that we have today in the capability of ASEAN. If you look into the lesson learned that we learned in COVID-19 is how dependent we are into the vaccines, Pfizer's, Sinovac's, and all the types of the vaccine produced by all the other countries. ASEAN doesn't even have their own. Does it mean that ASEAN are left behind because of this somehow insustainability of ASEAN health security economics? So this might be one answer that ASEAN to have to dig out to look into how to move forward regarding the powerhouse of Indonesia that basically are exploring the economics in very fast and dynamic trends, and might be one of the countries that we have to look forward to have a strong cooperation and leaderships in the ASEAN, because due to its numbers, capability, resources that have, and how the strategic cooperations in Malaysia, for example, looking into the context, the future of the element that we have in Sabah Sarawak, which is something that have to be taken care as a concept of Malaysia as unity value of nation, because the potential that we have in Sabah Sarawak to boost the economics of the ASEAN. And these representation have to be based by the strong diplomatic leadership of ASEAN consensus. Similarly, looking to the currently holding to the democratic value and looking to the ASEAN's identity, ASEAN inclusivity and sustainability, to make sure that the ASEAN promote a good elements of to reduce the digital divide. It is ASEAN responsibility not to interfere into the other country form of sovereignty, but ASEAN responsibility to move the ASEAN blocks in a form of consensus, form of economics blocks in form of this security. So this will bring a new foundation in ASEAN by putting a mapping what is the core power of ASEAN economics. So if you look into some important decision that happens post World War II, when basically the France and the British have lost their financial power, so the US came out with the Marshall Plans by the President Truman during that particular time to look into the Marshall Plan. So basically, Marshall Plan do, it bail out European recovery by putting up the pegging everything's under the US dollar and bringing up the industrial element towards the US foundations as one of the major bailout towards the EU economics, or most of the post-World War blocks of European power after the World War II have ended. So this is something that ASEAN have to look into that. So ASEAN need to have their own bailout. Might be similarly that we have a concept, IMF, World Bank, to look into the representation of this. So the bailout have to be structured into lots of other contexts. It might be looking into the agriculture, economic health security, cyber security, in fact, promoting much more investment into the health security. But we're not sure what will be the next potential disaster, the health security element threat that we might reach. So this is why that we have to have our own bailout by the superpower economic bloc in the context of ASEAN community, ASEAN country by itself.
Well, very insightful. Well, there's so much to unpack, but I think that's all the time we have. Well, thank you, Doctor. That was Dr. Noor Nirwandy Mat Noordin, Security and Political Analyst at the University Technology Mara UiTM Center for Media and Information Warfare Studies. Well, from strengthening political trust to driving economic resilience and fostering a deeper sense of regional identity, it's clear that these pillars are not just frameworks, but the very foundation of ASEAN's progress. That's all for ASEAN Kita. I'm Farhan Hakimi. Thank you for staying with us. See you again next time.